What the Bible actually says about anxiety and fear is not what most people expect, because the hardest part is not just the fear itself, it's the guilt that comes after it. You pray for peace, but your mind still races. You ask God for strength, but deep down you wonder why you still feel so overwhelmed. And eventually, you start asking the question nobody wants to admit out loud. If you really trusted God, why does fear still have such a grip on you? Because right now, it feels like your thoughts are getting louder. God feels quieter, and you are exhausted from carrying a future you were never meant to control. But what if the Bible never said real faith means never feeling afraid? What if the real battle is about who you trust when fear will not leave? You wake up tired, even after sleeping. Not always physically tired, but mentally tired, emotionally tired, spiritually tired. Your mind starts moving before your feet even touch the floor. Thoughts begin stacking on top of each other before the day has even started. What if something goes wrong? What if you make the wrong decision? What if the future becomes harder than you can handle? What if God is trying to tell you something and you are missing it completely? And the exhausting part is that you do not even want to think this way anymore. You pray about it. You ask God for peace. You tell yourself to trust Him. But somehow the fear keeps returning. Sometimes it returns quietly in the background like a constant hum you cannot turn off. Other times it crashes into your mind all at once and steals your ability to rest, focus, or even breathe deeply. You replay conversations. You imagine worst-case scenarios. You try to prepare for outcomes that have not happened. Your mind keeps searching for certainty. But the more you search, the more anxious you become. And eventually, you start asking a painful question that many believers are afraid to admit out loud. If I truly trusted God, why am I still struggling like this? That question carries more weight than people realize, because beneath the anxiety itself is often shame. You begin to feel guilty for being afraid. You hear verses about peace, trust, and faith, and instead of feeling comforted, sometimes you feel condemned. You assume that if your faith was stronger, your mind would be calmer. If you were spiritually mature enough, fear would disappear. If you were close enough to God, you would not feel this emotionally overwhelmed. So now, you are not only fighting anxiety, you are fighting yourself. You are fighting the feeling that you are disappointing God. And what makes this even harder is that outwardly your life may still look functional. You still show up. You still work. You'll still answer messages. You'll still smile in conversations. You still attend church. You still pray before meals. You still try to do the right thing, but internally, your thoughts feel loud all the time. You carry pressure nobody sees. You carry emotional exhaustion nobody fully understands. You carry fears you cannot always explain logically, and sometimes you become so mentally drained that even simple decisions feel heavy. You keep wondering why peace feels so difficult to hold on to. What many people do not understand is that anxiety is not always loud panic. Sometimes anxiety looks like constant mental scanning, constant anticipation, constant emotional tension. It is the inability to fully rest because part of your mind always feels responsible for preventing future pain. You're trying to stay ahead of everything, ahead of disappointment, ahead of failure, ahead of loss, ahead of uncertainty. But the human mind was never created to carry the full weight of tomorrow. And slowly, without realizing it, fear begins shaping the way you see everything, even your relationship with God. You start interpreting silence as distance, delays as rejection, uncertainty as danger, and unanswered questions as proof that something must be wrong. You pray, but part of you still feels unsafe. You worship, but your thoughts still race afterward. You read scripture, but fear keeps interrupting what truth is trying to build inside you. And one of the loneliest parts of this struggle is how confusing it feels spiritually, because you do love God. That is what makes this so painful. If you did not care, you would not wrestle this deeply. You want to trust Him. You want to rest in Him. You want to believe that He is in control. But your emotions keep pulling you in the opposite direction. And eventually you begin wondering if something is wrong with your faith itself. But what if the problem is not what you think? What if fear itself is not the evidence that God has left you? What if anxiety is not proof that your faith is fake? What if some of the strongest people in Scripture also wrestled deeply inside their minds? Sometimes Christians unintentionally create an image of faith that the Bible itself never presents. An image where strong believers are always emotionally steady, always confident, always fearless, always certain. But when you actually look closely at Scripture, you find something very different. You find people crying out to God in confusion. You find people waiting without answers. You find people overwhelmed by uncertainty. You'll find people asking questions in the middle of fear, and yet God still walked with them. That changes everything, because maybe faith was never about becoming emotionally untouchable. Maybe faith is not the absence of fear at all. Maybe faith is what happens when a person keeps turning toward God, even while fear is still speaking. That does not mean anxiety is easy. It does not mean emotional pain is imaginary. And it certainly does not mean every fearful thought immediately disappears once you pray. The Bible never treats human emotion as something fake or insignificant. God does not speak to fearful people as if they are weak failures. Again and again, throughout Scripture, He speaks to them with invitation. Do not be afraid, not as condemnation, as guidance, as reassurance, as presence. There is a difference, because when God tells people not to fear, it is often because they are already afraid. That means your struggle does not shock Him. Your anxious thoughts do not make Him pull away from you. Your emotional exhaustion does not disqualify you from His presence. And maybe you need to hear this clearly right now. You are not failing simply because you are struggling. You are not abandoned because your mind feels overwhelmed. You are not spiritually broken because peace feels difficult sometimes. Fear may be speaking loudly inside you right now, but fear is not automatically telling you the truth. That is one of the most important battles happening inside your life. The battle between what you feel and what is true. Because feelings are real, but they are not always reliable interpreters of reality. Fear often speaks in absolutes. You will never get through this. God is distant. Everything is falling apart. You must solve everything right now. But fear rarely pauses long enough to ask whether those thoughts are actually true. And the longer fear goes unquestioned, the more powerful it becomes. That is why anxiety can become spiritually exhausting. It is not just emotional discomfort. It becomes an internal war over who gets to shape your perspective, fear, or truth. And maybe that is where you are right now. Tired of fighting your own thoughts. Tired of carrying an invisible pressure. Tired of trying to appear okay while internally feeling overwhelmed. Tired of asking God for peace while wondering why your mind still feels restless. But there is something important you must understand before moving forward. God's presence in your life was never dependent on your ability to maintain emotional perfection. If that were true, nobody would survive spiritually. The truth is that God often begins His deepest work in people exactly where they feel weakest. Not after they become fearless. Not after they finally control every emotion. Right in the middle of the struggle. And that creates a question many people have never truly considered before. What if the goal is not becoming a person who never feels fear again? What if the real transformation is learning who you trust when fear appears? Because those are two very different things. And until you understand that difference, anxiety will continue convincing you that every emotional battle means spiritual failure. But the Bible tells a much deeper story than that. One of the most damaging misunderstandings many believers carry is the idea that strong faith should automatically remove emotional struggle. Somewhere along the way, many people began believing that fear itself is the evidence of spiritual weakness. So every anxious thought starts feeling like proof that something is wrong between them and God. But that belief quietly creates a cycle of shame. You feel afraid. Then you feel guilty for being afraid. Then the guilt makes you feel even more distant from God. And suddenly the struggle is no longer just emotional. It becomes deeply spiritual in your mind. You stop seeing anxiety as something you are walking through and start seeing it as your identity. But the Bible never defines people that way. When you look honestly at Scripture, you do not find flawless people walking confidently through every situation without emotional struggle. You find human beings wrestling with uncertainty, grief, fear, exhaustion, confusion, and waiting. You find people crying out in caves, people trembling before uncertain futures, people asking God difficult questions, people feeling overwhelmed by what they could not control, and yet God remained near to them in the middle of it. That matters more than most people realize, because many Christians secretly assume that God only stays close to emotionally strong people. But throughout Scripture, God repeatedly moves toward people in weakness, not away from them. Think about how often God says, "Do not fear." Those words appear again and again throughout the Bible, not because people were fearless, but because they were afraid. God was speaking directly into human emotion. He was acknowledging the fear while inviting people not to let fear become their master. That is completely different from shame. God does not respond to fear the way fear responds to fear. Fear says, "You are failing." God says, "I am with you." Fear says, "You are alone." God says, "Trust me one step at a time." Fear says, "You must control everything." God says, "Release what you cannot carry." The problem is that anxiety distorts how you hear everything. Even truth can begin sounding distant when your mind is exhausted. You can read comforting verses while internally still feeling unsafe. You can pray sincerely while emotionally feeling unstable afterward. And when that happens repeatedly, many people start assuming their faith must not be working. But faith was never meant to function like emotional anesthesia. Faith does not erase humanity. Faith anchors humanity. There is a difference. Many people expect trust in God to instantly remove all emotional tension, but often trust is formed inside the tension, not outside it. That changes how you understand your struggle completely, because if you believe real Christians should never feel afraid, then every fearful moment will convince you that you are spiritually defective. But if you understand that even faithful people experience emotional battles, then fear stops becoming proof of failure and starts becoming an opportunity to choose where you will turn. That does not mean fear is harmless. Fear can absolutely dominate a person's thinking if left unchecked. It can reshape your perspective until you start interpreting life through panic instead of truth. It can convince you that uncertainty is danger and that silence means abandonment. But the existence of fear itself is not the final story. What matters is what fear begins controlling, because fear always wants authority over your heart. It wants to shape your decisions, your identity, your expectations, your future, your relationship with God. And one of the ways it gains power is by convincing you that your emotions are the ultimate truth about reality. But emotions are not always accurate narrators. Sometimes your mind feels abandoned while God is still present. Sometimes your heart feels unsafe while God is still protecting you. Sometimes your emotions scream chaos while God is still working quietly underneath the surface. That tension between feelings and truth is one of the hardest spiritual battles a person can experience, especially because feelings feel immediate. Truth often requires patience. Fear feels urgent. Trust usually develops slowly, and your mind naturally wants immediate relief. That is why anxiety becomes exhausting. Your thoughts keep demanding certainty about things no human being can fully control. You want guarantees? You want clarity about the future? You want reassurance that nothing painful will happen? You want to know exactly how everything will turn out? But life does not work that way, and neither does faith. Faith has always required trust before full understanding. Not because God enjoys confusion, but because dependence grows in places where control ends. That is uncomfortable for the human heart, especially for people who have been hurt, disappointed, or emotionally overwhelmed before. Your mind begins trying to protect you from future pain by constantly preparing for every possible outcome. You replay scenarios repeatedly because part of you believes that if you think hard enough, you can prevent suffering before it happens. But overthinking rarely produces peace. It usually produces exhaustion, because the mind was never designed to carry infinite possibilities all at once. And eventually, fear begins draining joy from the present moment. You stop fully resting, fully enjoying, fully trusting, because part of your mind always remains braced for something to go wrong. Even spiritually, you may begin approaching God with tension, instead of openness. You pray while simultaneously expecting disappointment. You worship while internally questioning whether God is really listening. You ask for peace while secretly fearing it may never come. And underneath all of it is often one painful assumption. If God were truly near, I would not feel this way. But Scripture challenges that assumption repeatedly. Some of the people closest to God still walk through deep emotional struggle, not because God abandoned them, because they were human. And maybe this is where many people need healing the most, not only from fear itself, but from the shame attached to fear. Because shame, it makes you hide emotionally. It convinces you that your struggle makes you unacceptable. But God consistently invites struggling people toward Him, not away from Him. That means your anxious thoughts are not disqualifying you from God's love right now. Your emotional exhaustion is not making Him impatient with you. Your confusion is not making Him leave. In fact, some of the deepest spiritual growth begins when people stop pretending they are emotionally invincible and finally become honest before God. Not polished, not perfect. Honest. That honesty matters because healing cannot happen where pretending survives. And maybe you have spent years trying to appear spiritually strong while internally feeling exhausted. Maybe you learned how to quote truth while silently battling fear every day. Maybe you became skilled at hiding emotional struggles because you thought admitting them would make you seem weak. But God already sees what is happening inside you completely, and He is not shocked by it. That means you no longer have to carry the additional burden of pretending. You can bring your anxious thoughts honestly before Him. You can bring your fears honestly before Him. Can bring your exhaustion honestly before Him. Not because fear is good, but because hiding never heals anything. And this leads to another important realization many people miss. Sometimes anxiety grows stronger because you are trying to fight it entirely alone. You analyze every thought internally. You carry every burden mentally. You try to solve every uncertainty emotionally. But fear thrives in isolation, especially spiritual isolation. The more you believe you must overcome everything through your own mental strength, the heavier the battle becomes. And that is exactly where many people become trapped, because they confuse surrender with weakness. But the Bible presents surrender very differently. Surrender is not giving up. Surrender is releasing the illusion that you were ever meant to control everything in the first place. And until that truth becomes real inside your heart, anxiety will continue convincing you that survival depends entirely on you. But what if that is part of the burden exhausting you the most? One of the hidden reasons anxiety becomes so overwhelming is because your mind slowly starts carrying responsibilities that were never meant to belong to you. At first, it feels responsible, careful, prepared. You tell yourself you are simply thinking ahead, trying to avoid mistakes, trying to protect your future. But eventually the mental weight becomes unbearable because you are trying to control outcomes no human being can fully control. And the truth is, control can feel comforting in the beginning. Your mind believes, if I can predict every possibility, maybe I can prevent pain. If I stay mentally alert enough, maybe nothing will catch me off guard. If I analyze things deeply enough, maybe I can create certainty. But instead of producing peace, this usually creates exhaustion, because the future keeps moving beyond your reach, no matter how much you think about it. And anxiety feeds on that tension. It whispers that your safety depends entirely on your ability to anticipate everything correctly. So your mind keeps scanning for danger constantly. You rehearse conversations before they happen. You replay decisions after they happen. You imagine problems that do not even exist yet. You carry tomorrow emotionally, before tomorrow ever arrives. And eventually your inner world becomes crowded with invisible pressure. Pressure about finances. Pressure about relationships. Pressure about health. Pressure about purpose. Pressure about whether you are making the right choices. Pressure about whether God's plan is unfolding correctly. Some people become so mentally consumed with preparing for the future that they stop living in the present entirely. Their body is here, but their mind is always somewhere ahead, trying to solve a reality that has not arrived yet. And fear convinces you this is necessary. Fear says vigilance equals safety, but constant mental vigilance rarely creates peace. it usually creates emotional fatigue, because human beings were never designed to carry unlimited uncertainty all at once. That is why anxiety often feels physical as well as emotional. Your thoughts affect your body. Your nervous system stays tense. Your breathing becomes shallow. Your mind struggles to rest even during quiet moments because internally it still feels like something urgent must be solved. And what makes this especially painful spiritually is that many people begin placing impossible expectations on themselves. They feel responsible not only for their own future, but for making sure everything unfolds perfectly according to God's will. So every decision becomes terrifying. What if I miss God's direction? What if I make the wrong choice? What if one mistake ruins everything? That kind of pressure can quietly imprison the mind, because now every uncertainty feels spiritually dangerous. But the Bible never presents God as waiting for you to perfectly manage every detail of your life through fear-driven control. In fact, throughout Scripture, one of the deepest invitations God gives people is the invitation to trust Him with what they cannot carry. That sounds comforting until real uncertainty appears, because trust becomes hardest exactly where control disappears. Anyone can feel calm when outcomes feel predictable, but uncertainty exposes what the heart truly depends on. And many people discover during anxious seasons that they have unknowingly placed their security in control itself. Not intentionally, not rebelliously. Gradually, the human heart naturally reaches for certainty because uncertainty feels vulnerable. But there is a difference between wisdom and control. Wisdom seeks guidance. Control demands guarantees. And anxiety often grows in the space where guarantees cannot exist. That is why overthinking becomes addictive. Your mind keeps believing the next thought will finally solve the fear. But instead, each thought usually creates another layer of uncertainty. What if this happens? But what if that happens instead? What if things get worse? What if you are not ready? What if God does not come through the way you hoped? Fear always multiplies possibilities faster than peace can emotionally process them. And eventually you become trapped inside your own thoughts. The difficult part is that anxiety often disguises itself as responsibility. You tell yourself you are being careful, wise, mature, or prepared. But internally your soul is exhausted because you are trying to mentally sustain a future only God can fully see. And this is where many people unknowingly drift into a deeper spiritual burden. They begin carrying tomorrow as if everything depends entirely on them. Not just effort, everything, as though one wrong move will destroy their future forever. As though God's faithfulness depends on their flawless performance. As though peace can only exist once every uncertainty disappears. But peace built on certainty is extremely fragile because life always contains uncertainty. Real trust develops differently. Trust grows when a person slowly realizes that God's presence is more dependable than their ability to control outcomes. That realization does not happen instantly. In fact, many people resist it at first because releasing control feels terrifying. Control creates the illusion of protection. Even when it is exhausting, it still feels safer than surrender because surrender feels vulnerable. And vulnerability exposes fear. But what if part of your anxiety is actually revealing how much pressure you were never meant to carry alone? What if your exhaustion is not simply the result of weakness, but the result of trying to hold together realities only God can sustain? That changes how you see your struggle, because maybe your mind is tired, not because you are failing, but because you were never designed to function as your own source of ultimate security. There is a reason Jesus spoke so directly about worrying over tomorrow. Not because human concerns are meaningless, but because the human heart deteriorates when it tries to live in futures it cannot control. Fear keeps dragging your attention forward. Truth calls you back to dependence. Fear says, you must figure everything out right now. Truth says, you only have grace for today. Fear says, if you relax, everything will fall apart. Truth says, God is still working, even when you cannot see it. Fear says, you are alone in this responsibility. Truth says, you were never meant to carry life without God. That last truth is deeply important, because anxiety often isolates people emotionally from God, even while they continue believing in Him intellectually. You may still believe God exists. You may still believe His promises are true. but internally you continue living as though survival depends entirely on your own mental strength. And that creates unbearable pressure over time, especially when life becomes uncertain, especially when prayers feel unanswered, especially when outcomes remain unclear. The human mind desperately wants resolution. It wants immediate understanding. It wants visible evidence that everything will work out safely. But God often teaches trust in spaces where complete visibility does not exist. Not to punish you, to transform you. Because dependence changes the heart in ways control never can. Control keeps the illusion that you are sustaining yourself. Dependence teaches you who God actually is. And many people do not realize how deeply they have built their emotional stability around circumstances being manageable. So when life becomes uncertain, panic immediately rises because their peace was connected to predictability. But biblical trust is different. Biblical trust says, even if I do not fully understand what is happening, God remains faithful. That sounds simple until fear enters the room, because fear makes uncertainty feel catastrophic. And maybe that is why so many people feel emotionally exhausted today. They are trying to mentally conquer every possible future, instead of learning how to walk with God through uncertainty one day at a time. But one day at a time feels too slow for anxious minds. Your thoughts want complete answers immediately. Yet God often gives daily grace instead of complete explanations. And that can feel frustrating until you realize something important. If God revealed your entire future at once, your heart would probably try controlling that too. But trust grows differently, slowly, daily, moment by moment, not through mastering the future, but through learning that God remains present inside uncertainty itself. And maybe that is the deeper issue underneath your anxiety right now. Not simply fear of what could happen, but the exhausting belief that you must carry the future alone. One of the hardest seasons for the human heart is not always suffering itself. Sometimes it is silence, not physical silence, spiritual silence, the kind of silence where you keep praying, keep hoping, keep asking God for direction, and yet nothing seems to change immediately. No clear answers, no dramatic breakthrough, no instant relief, just waiting. And waiting becomes especially painful when your mind is already exhausted, because anxious thoughts do not handle silence well. Fear immediately starts filling in the gaps. Maybe God is disappointed in you. Maybe you are doing something wrong. Maybe He is distant. Maybe your prayers are not being heard. Maybe nothing will ever change. And the longer the silence lasts, the louder those thoughts can become. You begin searching your life constantly for explanations. You analyze your prayers, your decisions, your habits, your motives. You wonder whether you missed something spiritually important. You wonder whether God has stepped back from your life for reasons you cannot understand. And eventually silence starts feeling personal. That is what makes it so emotionally heavy. Because when people cannot see what God is doing, they often assume He is doing nothing at all. But Scripture repeatedly tells a different story. Again and again throughout the Bible, God continued working during seasons when people could not yet see the outcome. Some of the deepest transformations in Scripture happened in hidden places, quiet places, waiting places. Yet human emotion struggles deeply with hidden, especially when life already feels uncertain, because the mind naturally wants visible reassurance, something clear, something immediate, something that proves everything will be okay. But God often develops trust in environments where complete clarity does not yet exist, and that can feel deeply uncomfortable, particularly for people who already battle anxiety, because anxiety craves resolution. It craves certainty. It craves signs that eliminate fear completely. But spiritual growth often unfolds slowly enough that fear still has opportunities to speak along the way. That does not mean God is absent. It means trust is still being formed. The difficult part is that silence can expose what your heart truly depends on. When immediate answers disappear, deeper fears often rise to the surface. Fear of abandonment, fear of losing control, fear that your future is unstable, fear that you are walking alone. And many people become spiritually discouraged because they expected God's presence to always feel emotionally obvious. But feelings are not always accurate measures of spiritual reality. There will be moments in life where God feels quiet while still being near. Moments where you cannot trace what He is doing while He is still guiding you. Moments where your emotions feel unstable while His faithfulness remains unchanged. That tension is difficult, especially because modern culture trains people to expect immediate results, immediate answers, immediate relief, immediate understanding. But much of spiritual maturity develops through learning how to trust God before visible resolution appears. Not after, before. That is why waiting can feel so exposing. Waiting reveals how much the heart wants control, how much it wants certainty, how much it wants emotional guarantees. And when those guarantees do not arrive, fear starts creating interpretations. God forgot you. You are stuck forever. This silence means rejection, but silence and abandonment are not the same thing. A parent can remain present in a room without constantly speaking. A builder can remain active beneath the surface before visible results appear. A seed can be growing underground long before anything becomes visible above the soil. And in the same way, God's hiddenness does not mean inactivity. Some of His deepest work happens beneath the surface of your understanding. But anxious minds struggle with hidden processes because fear only trusts what it can immediately see. That is why anxiety often intensifies during waiting seasons. Your mind keeps trying to force certainty out of uncertainty. You search for signs constantly. You replay conversations. You overanalyze situations. You attempt to emotionally solve what time has not yet revealed. And the exhausting part is that this mental striving rarely creates peace. It usually creates more confusion because human beings cannot force clarity before it's time. There are moments where the hardest spiritual discipline is simply remaining anchored while answers are incomplete. Not passive, not hopeless. Anchored, that kind of trust is very different from emotional denial. Biblical trust does not pretend uncertainty feels easy. It simply refuses to let uncertainty become greater than God's character. And that is important because fear always magnifies what is unknown. It takes unanswered questions and turns them into catastrophic conclusions. But unanswered questions are not evidence that God has stopped caring for you. Sometimes the silence you fear is actually preparation happening beyond your vision. Preparation inside your character. Preparation inside your dependence. Preparation inside your understanding of who God truly is. Because many people unknowingly build their relationship with God around emotional reassurance rather than genuine trust. They feel close to Him when emotions feel peaceful and distant from Him when emotions feel unstable. But emotional intensity is not the same thing as spiritual reality. God's presence does not disappear every time your emotions fluctuate. If it did, nobody would survive difficult seasons spiritually. The truth is that some of the most spiritually mature people still experience moments where God feels quiet. The difference is not that they never struggle emotionally. The difference is that over time they learn not to interpret silence through fear. That process takes growth, and growth usually takes time, which is frustrating for anxious hearts because anxiety wants immediate certainty. But trust develops through repeated surrender in uncertainty itself. That means silence can become a place of transformation instead of panic. Not because uncertainty suddenly becomes comfortable, but because you slowly begin realizing that God's faithfulness is not dependent on your ability to emotionally feel Him every moment. That realization changes how you endure difficult seasons, because now your hope is no longer built entirely on emotional sensations. It becomes rooted in truth deeper than temporary feelings. Still, this struggle remains very real. There are nights where your thoughts feel loud, prayers feel repetitive, answers feel delayed, and your heart quietly wonders how long this season will last. Sometimes, the hardest part is watching life continue around you while internally feeling stuck. Other people seem confident, certain, peaceful. Meanwhile, you feel like your mind is fighting battles nobody else can see. And in those moments, fear tries convincing you that your struggle is evidence of God's absence. But Scripture repeatedly shows something different. God often stayed closest to people during their weakest seasons, not after they overcame fear completely. During the struggle itself, that means your waiting season is not wasted. Your confusion is not invisible to God. Your unanswered questions are not proof that He has abandoned you. And maybe what feels like silence right now is not rejection at all. Maybe God is teaching your heart something deeper than immediate relief. Because instant answers can calm emotions temporarily, but deeper trust transforms the heart permanently. And that transformation usually happens slowly enough that you must keep choosing trust before complete understanding arrives, which leads to another difficult but important realization. Sometimes the greatest battle is not whether God is present. It is whether fear will be allowed to define His silence for you. Fear becomes incredibly powerful when it is allowed to speak without being questioned. That is why anxiety often feels like a constant mental cycle. One fearful thought leads to another, then another, until eventually your mind feels completely overwhelmed by possibilities that may never even happen. And the dangerous part is that repeated thoughts begin feeling true simply because they are repeated often. Your mind imagines failure long enough that failure starts feeling inevitable. It imagines abandonment long enough that loneliness starts feeling permanent. It imagines disaster long enough that peace starts feeling impossible. That is why the battle against anxiety is not only emotional, it is deeply connected to the mind itself. Scripture speaks often about the importance of renewing the mind because God understands something many people overlook. The direction of your thoughts eventually shapes the direction of your heart. Fear knows this. That is why fear constantly tries to capture your focus, because whatever consistently holds your attention slowly shapes your perspective, and perspective shapes your emotional reality. If your mind spends every day rehearsing catastrophe, your emotions will eventually begin responding as though catastrophe is already happening. Your body reacts, your stress increases, your thoughts race faster, your peace disappears, even though the feared outcome may not even exist. That is one of the exhausting realities of anxiety. Your mind can create emotional suffering long before reality arrives. And sometimes the imagined future becomes more emotionally powerful than the present moment itself. This is why anxious minds struggle to rest. Fear keeps presenting itself as preparation. If you stop worrying, you will miss something important. If you stop thinking about the problem, you will lose control. If you relax, something bad will happen. So your mind remains constantly alert, constantly analyzing, constantly anticipating. But eventually, you begin realizing something painful. The thoughts never end on their own, because fear does not naturally create peace after enough analysis. Fear simply creates more fear. And that realization can feel discouraging at first, because many people secretly believe that if they just think hard enough, eventually they will mentally solve their anxiety completely. But peace rarely comes through endless mental control. Peace begins growing when truth becomes stronger than fear's narration. That is why renewing the mind matters spiritually. Renewing the mind does not mean pretending fearful thoughts never appear. It means learning not to automatically agree with every fearful thought that enters your mind. There is a difference. Not every thought deserves trust. Not every emotion deserves authority. Not every fear deserves obedience. Yet many people live as though every anxious thought is automatically prophetic. If fear says disaster is coming, they believe it. If fear says they are abandoned, they accept it. If fear says nothing will improve, they internalize it. But thoughts are not always truth. Sometimes they are simply reflections of exhaustion, uncertainty, past wounds, or emotional overload, and fear becomes stronger whenever it goes unchallenged. This does not mean you fight anxiety by becoming emotionally harsh toward yourself. Many people already do that. They attack themselves internally every time fear appears. Why am I like this? I should be stronger. I should trust God more. I should not struggle this much. But shame does not renew the mind. It usually deepens the cycle, because shame keeps your focus trapped on yourself instead of drawing you toward truth. Renewing the mind begins differently. It begins with learning how to pause before automatically accepting fear-esque conclusions. Fear says, everything is falling apart. Truth asks, is that actually true right now? Fear says, you cannot handle this. Truth says, you do not have to carry this alone. Fear says, God has abandoned you. Truth says, feelings are not the final authority over reality. This process takes practice because anxious thinking often becomes deeply automatic over time. Some people have spent years training their minds to anticipate danger before hope. Fear becomes the default lens through which they interpret life, and changing that pattern does not happen overnight. That is important to understand. Many people become discouraged because they expect instant emotional transformation. They pray once and assume all anxious thoughts should disappear immediately afterward. When fear returns, they think they failed spiritually. But spiritual growth is usually gradual. Renewing the mind is daily work, sometimes moment-by-moment work. It is repeatedly bringing your thoughts back toward truth instead of allowing fear to permanently direct them. And this is where prayer begins changing meaning. For many people, prayer becomes mainly an attempt to escape discomfort. They pray hoping every difficult emotion will instantly disappear. But biblical prayer is often less about escaping reality and more about surrendering reality to God. That changes everything, because now prayer is no longer performance. It becomes dependence. Instead of trying to prove your faith through emotional perfection, you begin bringing your actual fears honestly before God. Not filtered, not polished, honest. God, I am overwhelmed. God, I am afraid. God, I do not know how to carry this. God, my mind feels exhausted. That kind of honesty is not weakness, it is relationship. And many people discover something powerful in those moments. God is not repelled by human vulnerability. Fear may tell you to hide your struggles from Him. Truth invites you to bring them into His presence. That does not mean every anxious feeling disappears immediately after prayer. Sometimes peace arrives slowly, quietly, gradually, like light entering a dark room, one small opening at a time. And honestly, that gradual process can frustrate anxious hearts because anxiety wants immediate certainty. But gradual peace teaches dependence differently than instant relief would. Instant relief can make people dependent on feelings. Gradual trust teaches dependence on God Himself. There is a difference. One disappears when emotions fluctuate. The other remains, even during emotional storms. And this is where many people begin experiencing a major shift internally. They stop treating every fearful thought as ultimate truth. They begin recognizing that fear can speak loudly without deserving complete control. That realization creates space inside the mind again. Space to breathe, space to pause, space to remember truth before reacting emotionally. And over Chile, something important begins changing. Fear may still appear, but it no longer immediately controls every decision. That is significant because courage is not the absence of fearful thoughts. Courage is learning not to surrender your entire life to those thoughts. And that process often develops slowly through ordinary daily choices. Choosing prayer when your mind wants panic. Choosing truth when emotions feel unstable. Choosing surrender when control feels safer. Choosing trust before certainty fully arrives. Those choices may seem small in the moment, but they slowly reshape the heart over time. Because what you repeatedly focus on eventually grows stronger inside you. Fear grows through constant agreement. Faith grows through repeated dependence. And maybe this is where your transformation truly begins. Not when every anxious thought finally disappears forever, but when you stop believing every fearful thought deserves complete authority over your life. One of the most discouraging parts of anxiety is how often fear returns. Even after moments of peace, you pray sincerely. You feel calmer for a while. You regain clarity. And then suddenly, another wave of anxious thoughts appears. And immediately you wonder whether you are back at the beginning again. That cycle can make people feel hopeless. Not because they do not believe in God, but because they expected healing to happen faster. They expected one breakthrough moment to permanently remove every internal struggle. So when fear comes back, they assume nothing changed at all. But healing rarely moves in a straight line, and spiritual growth is almost never instant emotional perfection. That is important to understand because many people secretly measure faith by emotional consistency. If they feel peaceful, they believe they are trusting God correctly. If they feel anxious, they assume they are failing spiritually again. But emotions rise and fall constantly. Faithfulness is deeper than emotional fluctuation. There are days where your heart feels strong, days where trust feels natural, days where peace comes more. And there are other days where fear feels loud again, uncertainty feels heavy again, and your thoughts become difficult to quiet. That does not erase your growth. It means you are human. The problem is that anxiety often creates unrealistic expectations for healing. Your mind wants immediate arrival, immediate certainty, immediate emotional stability forever. But God often works through gradual transformation instead of instant emotional escape. And honestly, gradual transformation can feel frustrating because it requires patience with yourself. Patience is difficult for anxious minds. Anxiety constantly demands urgency. Fix this now. Figure this out now. Resolve every fear immediately. But deep healing usually happens slowly enough that you must keep choosing trust repeatedly along the way. Not once, repeatedly. Daily dependence is how trust becomes rooted deeply inside the heart. That means some of the most important spiritual moments in your life may not look dramatic at all. They may look ordinary from the outside. Choosing not to spiral into panic immediately. Pausing before agreeing with fear. Praying honestly instead of suppressing your emotions. Continuing forward even while uncertainty remains. Resting when your mind wants endless striving. Returning to truth again and again after fear interrupts your thinking. Those moments matter more than you realize, because trust is built through repetition. In the same way, anxious thinking becomes stronger through repeated fearful patterns. Faith grows stronger through repeated surrender. That process takes time. And many people struggle with this because they want complete emotional freedom before they feel safe enough to trust God fully. But often trust is developed while emotional healing is still unfolding. That means healing and struggle can coexist for a season. You can still be growing while fear occasionally appears. You can still be healing while some thoughts remain difficult. You can still be learning trust while emotionally feeling weak some days. That reality removes so much unnecessary shame, because many believers quietly feel disqualified every time anxiety They assume that if fear still exists, they must not have grown spiritually at all. But growth is not measured by the complete disappearance of every difficult emotion. Growth is measured by what gradually gains authority inside you. At one point, fear controlled your entire perspective immediately. Now, you pause before believing it completely. At one point, every anxious thought sent you spiraling for hours or days. Now, truth interrupts the spiral sooner. At one point, uncertainty convinced you God was absent. Now, part of your heart remembers His faithfulness even while emotions struggle. Those changes matter, even if they feel slow, especially because fear rarely leaves quietly. Fear fights to maintain control over your thinking. It wants to remain the loudest voice in your life. So whenever progress begins happening, fear often tries returning stronger for a moment. That can feel discouraging unless you understand something important. The return of fear does not automatically mean the absence of growth. Sometimes it simply means you are learning how to respond differently now. And that difference changes everything over time. Because peace is not built by never experiencing fearful thoughts again. Peace grows when fearful thoughts stop ruling your decisions, identity, and relationship with God. That is real freedom, not emotional numbness. Freedom. Freedom to breathe even when uncertainty exists. Freedom to trust God without needing immediate explanations for everything. Freedom to stop carrying the impossible burden of controlling the future alone. Freedom to acknowledge fear without surrendering completely to it. That kind of peace is deeper than temporary emotional comfort because it is rooted in relationship instead of circumstance. And relationship changes how you walk through difficult seasons. You stop asking, "How do I eliminate every fearful feeling forever?" And you begin asking, "How do I keep walking with God honestly through this moment?" That shift matters deeply because one question is built around control. The other is built around dependence. Dependence often feels weaker at first because it requires surrender. But over time, dependence becomes stronger than control, because it roots your life in something more stable than your own emotional strength. Control collapses whenever uncertainty increases. Dependence learns how to remain anchored, even inside uncertainty. And maybe this is one of the biggest misunderstandings people carry about faith. They assume courage means never feeling afraid again. But biblical courage usually looks different. Courage is continuing forward while fear still whispers. Courage is praying while your mind still feels restless. Courage is trusting God one more day without having every answer. Courage is refusing to let fear become your identity. That kind of courage does not always feel powerful emotionally. Sometimes it feels quiet, simple, hidden, but it is still deeply real. And God sees those hidden moments. He sees every time you choose trust again after disappointment, every time you return to prayer after mental exhaustion, every time you keep seeking Him while your emotions still feel unstable, every time you surrender tomorrow back into His hands instead of trying to mentally control it all night long. Those moments are not small. They are shaping your heart, slowly teaching you that peace is not found through mastering every uncertainty, but through learning who remains faithful inside uncertainty itself. And over time, something begins changing inside you. Not instantly, gradually. You stop panicking every time fear appears. You stop assuming every anxious thought is reality. You stop believing your emotions define your spiritual condition completely. You begin recognizing that fear may still visit your mind sometimes, but it no longer owns your identity. That realization becomes a turning point, because now your life is no longer built around avoiding fear at all costs. It becomes built around trusting God, even when fear tries to return. And that is where many people finally begin understanding something deeply freeing. God never demanded a perfectly fearless life from you. He asked for a heart willing to keep trusting Him through the process. There comes a moment in the healing process where something inside you begins shifting quietly. Not because every problem suddenly disappears, not because life finally becomes completely predictable, not because fear never speaks again, but because you slowly realize that fear no longer has to control who you are. That realization changes everything. For so long, you may have believed the goal was to become completely fearless, completely emotionally unaffected, completely certain about the future at all times. But now you begin understanding something deeper. God never asked you to become emotionally untouchable. He asked you to trust Him. There is a difference, because a person can still feel uncertainty while learning trust. A person can still experience difficult emotions while remaining deeply loved by God. A person can still walk through healing while growing spiritually stronger at the same time. And maybe that is the freedom your heart has been searching for all along. Not the freedom of never struggling again, but the freedom of no longer being ruled by the struggle. Fear may still appear sometimes. Certain nights may still feel heavy. Some seasons may still require deep dependence and daily surrender. But fear no longer gets the final word over your identity, your future, or your relationship with God. That is where peace begins becoming steadier, not because circumstances always improve immediately, but because your foundation changes. At one point, your peace depended on certainty. Now it begins dependent on God's presence. At one point, your emotions controlled your perspective completely. Now truth interrupts fear before it fully consumes you. At one point, every unanswered question felt like evidence of abandonment. Now you understand that silence does not mean absence. That transformation is powerful because it changes how you walk through life itself. You stop waking up believing you must mentally carry the entire future alone. You stop treating every fearful thought like prophecy. You stop demanding immediate emotional perfection from yourself. And slowly, your soul begins breathing again. There is still uncertainty in life, still unanswered questions, still moments where you wish you could see farther ahead. But now you understand something your anxious mind struggled to believe before. God is present even in uncertainty, not waiting at the end of your healing process. Present now, not only during your strongest moments, present during your weakest ones too. That truth becomes an anchor, because life will continue bringing situations beyond your control. There will still be moments where you do not know exactly what comes next. Moments where your emotions fluctuate. Moments where fear attempts to return and convince you that nothing has changed. But now you recognize fear differently. You no longer automatically bow to it. You no longer assume it speaks ultimate truth. You no longer let it define your entire spiritual condition. Instead, you begin responding differently. When fear sees you are alone, you remember God's faithfulness. When fear sees you cannot handle the future, you remember that you were never meant to carry the future alone. When fear sees everything depends entirely on you, you remember that God remains sovereign, even when life feels uncertain. That does not make you emotionless. It makes you grounded, and grounding changes how a person lives. You begin making decisions from trust instead of panic. You begin praying from honesty instead of performance. You begin resting without feeling guilty for not controlling everything constantly. You begin recognizing that healing is not weakness, dependence is not failure, waiting is not abandonment, and maybe most importantly, you begin realizing that God's love for you was never dependent on your emotional perfection. He did not love you only on the calm days. He remained faithful on the anxious days too. He remained near during the sleepless nights, during the confusion, during the silent prayers, during the moments where your mind felt exhausted from trying to hold everything together. He was still there, even when your emotions struggled to feel it. That realization creates a kind of steadiness anxiety could never produce, because fear constantly tells you that peace can only exist once every uncertainty disappears. But God teaches something deeper. Peace grows when trust becomes greater than the need for complete control. And trust grows slowly, daily, one surrendered thought at a time, one honest prayer at a time, one fearful moment handed back to God at a time. That process may not always feel dramatic, but it is deeply transformative. Because over time, you begin noticing something beautiful happening inside you. Your thoughts still move, but they no longer own you. Your emotions still fluctuate, but they no longer define you. Your fears still appear, but they no longer direct your entire life. Instead of constant panic, there is increasing steadiness. Instead of emotional chaos controlling every moment, there is growing clarity. Instead of carrying tomorrow alone, there is surrender. And surrender finally creates space for peace. Not perfect peace every second, but real peace. The kind that remains present even while healing is still unfolding. The kind that allows you to breathe again. The kind that reminds you God is patient with your process, because transformation is rarely instant. But God is faithful through every stage of it. And maybe that is what you needed to hear most today. You are not abandoned because you struggle with fear. You are not weak because healing takes time. You are not failing because your emotions fluctuate. God is still with you, still guiding you, still strengthening you, still teaching your heart how to trust Him more deeply than before. Fear is real, but it does not have to rule your life anymore. Not because you suddenly became emotionally perfect, but because you are learning something stronger than fear itself. God's presence remains steady, even when your emotions are not. And when that truth finally begins settling deeply inside your heart, anxiety slowly loses the power to define your future. You may still be healing, but you are no longer hopeless. You may still face uncertainty, but you are no longer facing it alone. And that changes everything. If this message spoke to something deep inside your heart, take a moment to reflect on it honestly. Share your thoughts in the comments and let other people know they are not alone in this struggle. And if you want more biblical encouragement for seasons of fear, waiting, and spiritual growth, subscribe and continue walking through this journey together. Because even in the middle of uncertainty, God is still leading you toward peace.